Hello, friends, and welcome back to Professor Pastor Paul's Midweek Bible Festival. This week we find ourselves again in the Gospel of Mark. Our passage today is Mark 1, verses 21 through 28. Here it is from the New Revised Standard Version. They went to Capernaum. And when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, throwing him into convulsions and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once, his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. The word of God for the people of God. So like I said, we return this week to the Gospel of Mark, right where we left off last week, exact same spot. You will remember that Mark is just told of Jesus' initial proclamation of his ministry. The time is fulfilled. And of Jesus calling his first four disciples, Simon, Andrew, James, and John, who left their livelihoods and their families to join Jesus on the way. That has just happened. So the "they" of our first verse must mean Jesus and these four fellows. So the picture, we have Jesus, Simon, Andrew, James, and John, all in Capernaum, a nice city on the north shore of Galilee, of the Sea of Galilee. And when the Sabbath arrives, they visit the synagogue, which of course was standard Jewish custom. While there, Jesus begins to teach. Now, full confession, I don't know. I should probably ask Pastor David. But I suspect that just walking into the synagogue and teaching for a normal average guy is not normal. It is one thing for Jesus, as an of-age male, to read scriptures at the synagogue, as he does in Luke 4. But it is another thing entirely for Jesus to walk in and teach. He has no credentials, no official religious training, no titles, is not part of a distinguished family. He's just a dude from Nazareth. This is like being from Snellville. No offense to folks from Snellville. But it's just a place, right? Okay, maybe that was offensive to people in Snellville. I apologize. It's like being from Snellville. Somebody who just shows up and begins teaching. That's not normal. Apparently, he doesn't ask anyone for permission or get clearance to do this. He just comes in with his people, his entourage, and starts instructing. And something about Jesus attracts everyone, even the demons, as we'll see. Everyone is amazed at what he is saying, though we have no record of his exact words. But his teaching is more than his words, it's also his actions. Yet even before he heals the possessed man, he is singled out, noticed, and paid attention to because he teaches them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Now that line is loaded with significance. As one with authority and not like the scribes. Let's take it one phrase at a time. As one with authority. What does authority mean to you? I can think of at least two different ways of thinking about authority. There may be more, but I'm going to pick out two. The first is what you might call, say, credentialed authority. One who knows a subject well has sometimes received a degree from an institution of learning, such as a university. For us, this would mean maybe a bachelor's or a master's, or maybe even an MD or a PhD. These degrees are outward signs of an inward reality. This person knows some things, knows some stuff about a particular subject, and in the case of professions like social workers, say, or judges, or medical professionals, it means that they possess certain skills as well. If I have a question about the history of Christianity, it'd be nice if I could ask it to someone with a graduate degree in the history of Christianity, or a pastor with a degree from a seminary. Earlier on, I said I don't know if it was unusual for Jesus to walk into the synagogue and start teaching. I should ask Pastor David, who is credentialed. That's who I would ask. Now, somebody else may know it out there, but I'm going to ask somebody who I think has a good chance of knowing it, somebody with a credential. If I need heart surgery, I would not consider anybody without an MD and some experience as well. Now, one thing about credentialed authority, listen close, it is limited. It is always externally granted. That's what credentialing means, externally granted. And it signals knowledge and not wisdom. You know the difference. Knowledge puffs up, says St. Paul in this same week's readings. You know the difference. Knowledge is understanding that a tomato is a fruit, and wisdom is when you do not put tomatoes in your fruit salad. Right? It's the application, it's the smart application of knowledge. Wisdom is the wise application of knowledge. Knowledge alone is understanding that officially there is no such thing as a seagull. That is knowledge. Seagull is not a word that birders use for any bird. Okay? So seagull, it's a common word, but it's not one that's, official bird word. That's knowledge. It's limited. Wisdom is not correcting your wife when she points and says, "Look, seagulls." Right? You don't correct your wife in a situation like that. You admire the birds and you're happy for you and for her for being in the presence of those birds. That's what you do. You don't correct your wife, as hard as it might be to not do that. And degrees like BS and MFA and PhD and MD are typically granted for knowledge and not wisdom. You demonstrate knowledge. So you can have knowledge without wisdom, but you cannot have wisdom without knowledge. Hear that again. You can have knowledge without wisdom. Plenty of people can use knowledge for ill purposes. But you cannot have wisdom without knowledge. Wisdom is knowledge plus. Of course, much knowledge is not externally credentialed, and this brings us to what I would call the other kind of authority, uncredentialed authority. Uncredentialed authority. You see it everywhere. Life is filled with it. I find uncredentialed authority in close friends and family. People who know invaluable truths that will never, ever win them flashy degrees or fancy titles, and they wouldn't want them anyway. I personally find it in my 12-step peers, many of them, if not all of them, people who have been to the wilderness and who know how to survive there and maybe also know how to get out. Uncredentialed authority. In this case, uncredentialed authority, the line between knowledge and wisdom is thinner and harder to see, and in some cases, that line between knowledge and wisdom may not exist at all. Uncredentialed authority is always authoritative. Fully. It is always, I should say, contains wisdom. Always. Jesus, as I said, is not credentialed. His authority is of the uncredentialed variety. And here comes the second phrase of that line. He spoke with authority and not as the scribes. Scribes did not speak the same way Jesus did. But their authority, make no mistake, is fully credentialed. So is this all that the people mean when they say that Jesus speaks with authority and not as the scribes? Are they merely saying that Jesus has no formal education on religious matters, unlike the scribes? Are they just pointing out this plain fact? He didn't have any degrees. He didn't have any fancy robes. He's not like the scribes. That's not really what they mean, is it? I think what they mean when they say his authority is not like the scribes, I think it's because Jesus' authority is animated precisely by what the scribes lack, which is wisdom. The scribes had authority without wisdom. In fact, the scribes are apparently the very picture of authority without wisdom. They have the outer signs of authority. They have the signs. They have the outward image, they appear to have authority, education, titles, nice robes, high social status. But the living heart of authority, which is wisdom, has gone missing. They are, as Jesus says later, whitewashed tombs, bright and clean on the outside, but full of death and rot within. Please understand, this is not to dismiss or devalue credentialed authority. Credentialed authority plays an exceptionally important role in any society, especially more technological advanced ones like our own. We need experts. Experts are good. Credentialed people are good. Credentials are good. And experts have been, if I may speak frankly, I believe a little bit devalued lately, even dangerously so, at least here in America. This devaluation of experts has come at the expense, I think, of the common good. Public health, education, our religious and political systems have been severely damaged, I think, because so many people believe that their thoughts on any given subject carry just as much weight as anyone else's, no matter the subject, no matter their lack of knowledge. They have no credentialed knowledge, and they think that their knowledge is as good as those who have credentials. And I think they're sincere in that belief, but it is nonetheless harmful. All this to say, let me hop off my bandwagon here, all this to say is that I am, without a doubt, an evangelist for credentialed knowledge. I got no problem with those priests' educations or even their nice clothes. No problem with that. But they lack wisdom. Let us never, so I am an evangelist for credentialed knowledge, but never mistake it for wisdom. Never mistake it for wisdom. At the same time, let us not make the mistake of thinking that those who are credentialed are simply hollow men and women with no wisdom at all. This is apparently true of some of the scribes in Jesus' day, but certainly you and I can make a nice list of people that we know who possess both credentials and wisdom. What it was the deep, deep wisdom of Jesus' words. That deep wisdom coupled with his complete lack of outward credentials that so surprised the people in the synagogue that day. It was the contrast between his outward appearance and what came out of his mouth when he spoke. He was just a guy. What they experienced, what they witnessed, was a few words of power. The contrast between a few words of power and authority spoken by a common man in plain clothes set against the many empty words of highly educated scribes in full religious regalia. It was that contrast, I think, that shocked them. Here was something new. What also shocked them is what came after his words. Mark tells us, "Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, 'What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God.' But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, saying, 'Be silent and come out of him.' And the spirit, throwing him into convulsions and crying with a loud voice, came out of the man." Even the demons recognized the authority of Jesus. They didn't need to see any fancy clothes. They didn't need to see any fancy degrees. They knew authority when they saw it, and they recognized the authority of Jesus when they came across it, and they were right to be afraid, for it was just that same authority that drove them out. This was an outward sign of deep-seated wisdom and authority that made Jesus famous. We're told at once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. Nothing like healing a demon-possessed man in front of everybody in the synagogue to get the word out. And he began to be famous in Galilee. So friends, words and deeds of uncommon authority in the synagogue in Capernaum. Thus begins the ministry of Jesus according to Mark. Please join us next week when we find out what's next on the way with Jesus. Amen.